New shocking details in a stunning admission from Joran van der Sloot in the murder of Natalee Holloway, who disappeared 18 years ago in Aruba.
For nearly 2 decades, the disappearance of Natalee Holloway has remained one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in modern true crime history. Countless theories, dead ends, and emotional searches kept her name alive, but never brought real answers. Now, in 2025, newly surfaced evidence has finally shed light on what really happened that night in Aruba. But instead of comfort, the truth delivers something far more unsettling than anyone expected. What was finally uncovered changes everything we thought we knew. The Aruba trip that turned into a nightmare. It was supposed to be the kind of trip every teenager dreams about: sun, beaches, celebration, and freedom after high school. In May 2005, 18-year-old Natalee Holloway from Alabama joined her classmates on a graduation trip to Aruba, expecting nothing more than a carefree getaway.
Tonight's Whatever Happened To segment, Natalee Holloway, the Alabama teenager, was on a graduation trip to Aruba when she disappeared back in 2005.
But what began as a celebration quickly turned into one of the most haunting missing person cases in modern history. Natalee was last seen during the final night of her trip, just before she was scheduled to return home. After that moment, she simply vanished. No confirmed sightings, no clear trail, and no immediate explanation. When she failed to show up for her flight, alarm bells went off almost instantly. Back in the United States, her family's concern escalated quickly. Calls went unanswered, and messages stopped coming through. What initially seemed like a delay soon turned into panic. Authorities in Aruba were alerted, and a search operation began almost immediately across the island. Hotels, beaches, and surrounding areas were combed through, but early efforts produced no solid leads. The lack of physical evidence made the case even more frustrating. It was as if Natalee had disappeared without leaving a trace. Then, attention shifted toward the last known person to see her alive, Joran van der Sloot. A local teenager who had met Natalee during her stay, he quickly became the central figure in the investigation. From the very beginning, his statements raised questions. His accounts of that night shifted over time, creating confusion and suspicion among investigators. Despite multiple interrogations and searches, no concrete evidence was found, and no arrests were made at that early stage. The case began to stall, trapped between speculation and silence. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, hope slowly faded. But the mystery only grew deeper. Rumors spread, theories multiplied, and one question refused to go away. What really happened to Natalee Holloway after that final night in Aruba?
And as investigators dug deeper into the people she last encountered, the story began to take a darker and far more complicated turn.
A web of lies, extortion, and broken confessions. Even with a confession now on record, understanding the full picture of Joran van der Sloot's involvement means looking at the long trail of deception that surrounded him for years. The most unsettling part isn't just what he eventually admitted, but how many versions of the story he gave before that moment ever arrived. From the beginning, his accounts of that night in Aruba kept shifting. First, he claimed Natalee was safely dropped off at her hotel. Then, that version changed. He said he left her alone on the beach. Each statement contradicted the last, and every new explanation only deepened suspicion. Still, without a body or concrete evidence, investigators were stuck in a loop of uncertainty. What made things even more disturbing was how he seemed to feed off the attention. Over the years, he resurfaced repeatedly with new claims about what happened, none of which ever held up under scrutiny. In one infamous case, a hidden recording made by Dutch journalist Peter R. de Vries captured Joran appearing to describe how Natalee died and what he did with her body.
Then you have a giant angel hanging over your head.
I was even able to sleep that night. I just went home and went to bed.
But later, he dismissed it as a fabricated story meant to impress someone he believed was a criminal contact. The contradictions didn't stop there. In 2010, he attempted to profit from the Holloway family's desperation. He demanded $250,000 from Beth Holloway in exchange for revealing the location of Natalee's remains. After receiving money, he led investigators to a false site, another dead end in a case already filled with them. And even that wasn't the end of his criminal path. While the Natalee case stayed unsolved, Joran was later convicted in Peru for a separate murder, revealing a far darker pattern that extended beyond one disappearance. With each layer uncovered, a troubling question emerges. Was this ever just about one crime, or something much more calculated beneath the surface? 20 years later, the truth finally slipped out. For nearly 2 decades, the Natalee Holloway case stayed trapped in uncertainty, fueled by speculation, failed searches, and a suspect who never stopped changing his story. Then, in 2023, something finally shifted in a way no one expected. Facing legal pressure in a separate case and an impending extradition, Joran van der Sloot made a confession that investigators later described as both detailed and credible. This time, there were no vague statements or carefully worded denials. His account directly admitted to what authorities had long suspected but could never prove. He described how things escalated on the night Natalee disappeared. According to his statement, he attempted to force himself on her, and when she resisted, the situation turned violent. In his words, he struck her with a heavy object, a cinder block, and believed she died from the blow. He then admitted to moving her body and pushing it into the ocean. Unlike earlier stories that shifted and collapsed under pressure, this version came under formal legal conditions as part of a plea agreement. That detail mattered. For investigators, it meant the confession carried legal weight and could not simply be dismissed as another manipulation tactic. For Natalee's family, the moment was devastating in a different way. It wasn't the shock of new information, it was the confirmation of a truth they had spent years chasing through silence, rumors, and false leads. Everything they had hoped was wrong turned out to align with what the suspect himself finally admitted. But even as the confession closed one chapter, it raised another disturbing realization: how much of this truth had been buried under years of deception, and how many opportunities for clarity were lost along the way. Because the investigation didn't always move toward answers. At one point, it took a sharp turn that led authorities down an entirely different path, one that briefly shifted suspicion away from the main suspects and deeper into the chaos of conflicting leads and pressured decisions. Wrong suspects, shifting stories, and a case falling apart. As the search for Natalee Holloway continued, the investigation quickly turned into a tangled web of pressure, speculation, and rapidly changing leads.
Joran van der Sloot was not arrested until 10 days after Natalee went missing. And I think the news media...
What should have been a straightforward missing person case instead became one of the most confusing and controversial investigations in modern crime history. Just days after her disappearance, Aruban authorities arrested Joran van der Sloot, along with brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo, on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. Under local law, suspects could be held if there was strong suspicion, but they still required solid evidence to justify continued detention. That evidence, however, never came quickly enough to bring clarity. Deputy Police Chief Gerald Dompig later revealed that these 3 men had been central figures in the investigation from the very beginning. Within days of Natalee being reported missing, police had already started surveillance operations, tapping phones and monitoring communications. Despite this early focus, the case remained frustratingly unclear. Pressure from Natalee's family and growing international attention added urgency to the investigation. According to Dompig, this external pressure may have pushed authorities to make arrests earlier than planned, before they had gathered enough concrete proof. That decision would later fuel criticism about how the case was handled. Then came another wave of confusion. On June 11, 2005, a spokesperson for Aruba's Justice Ministry publicly stated that Natalee was dead and that investigators knew the location of her body. The statement spread quickly, only to be withdrawn hours later, with officials claiming it was based on incorrect information. The damage, however, was already done, adding more uncertainty to an already unstable case. That same night, conflicting reports emerged suggesting that one of the suspects had described a violent incident on the beach and was cooperating with authorities. Yet, the next day, prosecutors refused to confirm any such admission, only stating that the investigation had reached a critical stage. The situation grew even more complicated when additional arrests were made, including local DJJ Steve Gregory Kroes, who was later released, and even Joran's father, Paulus van der Sloot, who was briefly detained before being cleared. Each development seemed to lead nowhere. Meanwhile, the suspects' stories kept shifting. One version claimed Natalee was dropped off safely at a hotel. Another suggested she never left the beach with them. Each new statement contradicted the last, leaving investigators struggling to separate truth from manipulation. Despite extensive searches, including military assistance, infrared scans, and satellite comparisons of terrain changes, no physical evidence was ever found. Every lead seemed to dissolve before reaching a conclusion. And yet, beneath all the confusion and contradictions, one critical question remained unresolved. What really happened in those final moments before Natalee disappeared? And how close were investigators to the truth without even realizing it? What really happened to Natalee Holloway that night? When Joran van der Sloot finally spoke in 2023 under formal legal pressure, the long-running mystery surrounding Natalee Holloway's disappearance finally reached its most definitive point. After years of shifting stories, denials, and contradictions, his account this time came with unsettling clarity. According to his confession, the events that night escalated in a way that turned fatal. He admitted that he attempted to force himself on Natalee. When she resisted and fought back, the situation turned violent. In his statement, he said he grabbed a heavy concrete object, a cinder block, and struck her in the head. He claimed the blow was fatal. What followed was even more disturbing. He described moving her body afterward and placing it into the ocean, deliberately ensuring it would not be found. With that act, he believed he had erased any physical trace of what happened that night, leaving investigators with nothing but uncertainty for years. For nearly 20 years, Natalee's family lived in that uncertainty. Every new lead, every rumor, every supposed breakthrough always ended the same way: empty. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all continued to change his narrative, at times offering false confessions or misleading information, including attempts to trade fabricated details about her location for money. This final confession stood apart from everything that came before it. It wasn't presented in an interview or leaked through speculation. It was made under legal conditions, tied to a plea agreement, and reviewed by authorities who determined it carried credibility based on known case details. Still, even with this admission, closure came in a painful form. It confirmed the worst fears of those who had waited for answers, but it did not restore what was lost. Instead, it highlighted how much time had passed without resolution, and how many years were consumed by deception. And yet, one of the most haunting parts of the case remains unresolved. Despite the confession, Natalee Holloway's body was never recovered. That single fact continues to cast a shadow over the entire case. Over the years, search efforts covered almost every possible area of the island: landfills, ponds, coastal waters, and remote terrain. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched underwater sites. Even advanced imaging tools and satellite comparisons were used to detect changes in the land. Each attempt ended without results. Investigators believe that if Natalee was placed in the ocean, natural forces likely ensured her remains would never be recovered. Currents, marine activity, and time itself would have erased any physical trace long ago. Despite that, occasional theories still emerge suggesting she could one day be found. But most experts agree the chances are extremely slim. The emotional toll of this reality is just as significant as the investigation itself. For her family, the confession answered the question of what happened, but not the question of where she is now. That absence continues to define the case more than anything else. And as the truth finally came into focus, another perspective began to emerge. One not just about the crime itself, but about the person behind it. Because before everything changed that night in Aruba, Natalee Holloway was a young woman with a full life ahead of her. A life that was cut short far too soon. The life behind the headlines. Who Natalee really was. Before the headlines, the theories, and the global attention,
the prime suspect in the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, Jorn van der Sloot, has admitted to killing her and has been sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Natalee Holloway was simply a young woman full of promise, energy, and plans for the future. Her disappearance would later dominate international news, but her life before that moment tells a very different story, one that is often overshadowed by the mystery surrounding her death. Natalee Ann Holloway was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and grew up as the eldest child in her family. After her parents divorced, she was raised by her mother, Beth Holloway, alongside her younger brother, Matthew. Despite the early changes in her family life, she remained active, social, and driven throughout her childhood. In 2000, her mother remarried George "Jug" Twitty, a businessman from Alabama, and the family eventually settled in Mountain Brook, a suburban community known for its strong academic environment. It was here that Natalee truly began to thrive. At Mountain Brook High School, she stood out not only academically, but also socially. She graduated with honors in May 2005 and was involved in multiple school activities. She was part of the National Honor Society and participated in dance and other extracurricular programs. Teachers and classmates often described her as outgoing, kind, and someone who naturally brought people together. Her future looked incredibly bright. Natalee had already been accepted into the University of Alabama, where she planned to pursue a pre-med track. Becoming a doctor was one of her biggest goals, and she had worked consistently toward that path. Everything suggested a future filled with opportunity. But beneath her confident exterior, like many young people, Natalee also experienced the emotional ups and downs of growing up. She was navigating the pressures of school, identity, and the transition into adulthood. Nothing in her daily life suggested the tragedy that would soon unfold. At the time of her disappearance, both of her parents were living relatively stable lives. Her father worked as an insurance agent, while her mother worked in the education system. They were proud of her achievements and focused on supporting her next chapter in life. Then came the trip that changed everything. In May 2005, Natalee traveled with classmates to Aruba for a graduation celebration, a trip meant to mark the end of high school and the beginning of adulthood. It was supposed to be a carefree escape filled with memories, laughter, and celebration. Instead, it became the starting point of a mystery that would stretch across decades, capture global attention, and eventually lead to one of the most talked-about confessions in modern true crime history. But even with the case now partially answered, the focus shifts back to the unanswered emotional weight behind it all. Because beyond the investigation, beyond the suspects, and beyond the courtroom revelations, there are still the people left behind, those who had to live with the silence, the uncertainty, and the long years of waiting. And that leads to a different kind of aftermath, one that begins after the case fades from headlines, but never truly leaves the lives it touched. After Natalee Holloway disappeared, her family's life was never the same again. The silence that followed stretched from days into years, and eventually into nearly 2 decades of waiting, hoping, and searching for answers that never came quickly enough. Instead of stepping away from the pain, Beth Holloway chose to transform it into purpose. She created the International Safe Travels Foundation, an organization focused on educating people about safety while traveling abroad. What began as personal grief slowly became a mission to help protect other families from experiencing the same kind of uncertainty and heartbreak. Later on, she continued her advocacy by helping establish the Natalee Holloway Resource Center in Washington, D.C. The center was built to support families of missing persons, offering guidance and raising awareness for cases that often go unnoticed or unresolved. Natalee's story also reached a global audience through documentaries and television films, which kept her case in public memory long after the initial headlines faded. These adaptations brought renewed attention to what happened in Aruba and ensured that her name was never forgotten. Even with all the media coverage, Beth continued speaking publicly, refusing to let her daughter's case disappear into silence. Over the years, she became one of the most recognizable voices for missing persons advocacy, using her platform to push for awareness and justice. But even after the confession in 2023, the emotional weight did not disappear. While answers finally came, they did not bring the kind of closure most people imagine. Instead, they confirmed a painful truth that had been delayed for years. Natalee's case now stands as more than just a solved mystery. It is a reminder of how long families can wait for answers, and how even truth, when it arrives late, cannot undo what has already been lost. And in the end, her story leaves behind a lasting question, not just about what happened to her, but about how many other families are still waiting for their own answers in silence. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more stories like this. Click the next video on screen for more true crime content.